so much to you, Beck, and to Rob for inviting me to be part of this wonderful seminar series. It's fantastic to be with you, and thank you to everybody who's participating today. So, yeah, it's a real pleasure. I'm actually doing a kind of condensed version of a keynote that I gave last year at Open Education Global Forum. And so, for those of you who have already heard that keynote, I hope it's interesting again. But this will be a much more condensed version of it. And I'll just give you an overview of the presentation. It will last for about 35 minutes, and then there will be time for us to have a discussion. And I really hope it resonates with your interests and your commitments and your experiences too. So I'm very keen to hear about that. So I'm going to, in this presentation, first of all, explore the autobiography of the question. I'm going to engage us in some critical questioning about what we're open to, really playing on that idea of openness. And then I'm going to open up space for a multidimensional social justice reimaginary of higher education for equity and social justice, and open time for us this evening together to think about social justice praxis through the lens of a case study that I'm going to offer of the Gender Justice Hub. And I won't be able to go into detail about that, but I'll give you a flavor of that work. And when I'm also going to share some personal experiences, some which are very raw. So I just want to prepare you for that as I go through. So I'm going to start by thinking about this idea of the autobiography of the question, which I first came into contact with in 1995, 30 years ago, when I was a master's student at the Institute of Education, University of London. And I had a wonderful inspirational tutor, Jane Miller, who had developed this concept to open space for her students to bring the stories of the questions that they were exploring, both in their studies, their masters, but also the wider literatures that they were engaging. And Jane knew that teachers brought a wealth of experience to their master's degrees, but they also found the conventions of academic writing sometimes, and also the conventions of research, rather daunting and intimidating at times. So, this autobiography of the question was a methodological tool to bring students into the research process, to bring themselves into the research process. And the concepts really captured my imagination. And I have adapted the autobiography of the question concept ever since as a pedagogical tool to open space for students and participants from various different contexts to explore the socio-historical histories and values that they bring to the questions they're exploring, which are always, of course, in relation to wider histories and wider social relations. So we want to resist that sort of urge towards the individualization of the questions that we ask through the autobiography of the question, this idea of auto slash biography, that the personal is the social, the personal is the political. And this expands processes of personal exploration and enables a deep reflexivity by situating oneself in wider debates, literatures, and ideas. So I'm going to very briefly share my autobiography of the question with you to illustrate the power of the concept, to bring to light key themes and insights that extend beyond ourselves, to grasp the multidimensional nature of trauma, injustice, and inequality and their challenges for developing equity in, through, and beyond higher education, and their broader impact on educational access and participation, and the idea of sustained educational disadvantage over time and space. So, 35 years ago, I fled a violent relationship and life or death circumstances with my baby son after being forcibly dislocated from California to England. And so at the age of only 21, I became homeless and terribly dislocated. But my baby filled me with hope and the will to transform our life circumstances. I had left school at the age of around 16, so I had no education at this time. And in England, I was very fortunate to receive the care of a social welfare state that provided me refuge, health care, legal aid, refuge staff who helped me navigate an unwieldy social services system. I had access eventually to social housing. And finally, a couple of years later, I had access to an open access to higher education program that was truly transformative. Through a friend, I discovered this access to higher education program, and I can still feel the pure joy and excitement after attending an open evening. Once at university, after this incredible experience of doing the 1 year program full time, I met many mature women students who had accessed education themselves against the odds. My peers filled me with a new determination to advocate for widening participation in and access to higher education, which became my life's work. I was very fortunate that at this time in the early 1990s in England, I had access to free higher education and subsidized childcare. I also experienced the power of recognition through generous mentors who encouraged me to keep going with my academic journey through a master's degree. And at the time, I had no idea what a master's degree was. And then on to a research council funded PhD with the support of some incredible mentors. I was driven by the project to passionately advocate for continued open access to higher education, and I threw myself into numerous different projects, developing a return to study program, moderating multiple access programs across the greater London region, and working collaboratively to understand the different challenges that students faced whilst also navigating complex inequalities. And through all of these experiences, I came to understand that the shame associated with experiences of profound trauma and injustice is not simply a barrier that a person overcomes. It is a persistent structure of feeling that creates the conditions of a sense of not belonging and of unworthiness through stigmatization, deficit imaginaries, and entrenched forms of institutionalized misrecognition. And I'm just going to read a paragraph from a recently published essay in a collection, a book collection called Women of a Certain Courage. And in this paragraph, I explain that knowledge making became accessible in new and exciting ways through the suggestion of a friend who read my honors dissertation and encouraged me to undertake a postgraduate degree. His recognition that my research was important so totally shifted my self perception. Recognition felt so different to shame. New avenues were open to me, yet the shame of trauma was so insidious I could only walk a narrow path, the one where I believed I could make a difference to other women or to my family, but I still did not believe in me. I was continuously in a state of displacement, of unbelonging, of self disorientation. Yet, through the language of feminist, decolonial, anti racist praxis, and over many years of dedicated research, I developed an authorial voice of my own, and I found the courage to speak and write about the injustice of status subordination or misrecognition and its manifestation and shame as a form of symbolic violence, a social emotion emanating from an institutionalized and unequal cultural value order. So that's the end of that quote from that essay. But I will be taking up these themes of redistribution, recognition, and representation throughout this presentation, and I really hope that you can make connections with your own autobiography of the question as I go through, and this resonates with you in some way. So, I want to start by provoking our imaginations through critical questioning. What is the role of higher education in being and doing what we call open? And I think that we must resist what I call the Tina effect, the idea that there is no alternative to the status quo. We must think that there are always possibilities for different ways of being, thinking, and doing against the hegemonic order of which neoliberalism and its intersections with other forms of injustice have profoundly reframed the purpose of higher education through privileging economic, corporate, commercialized, and marketized views, and simultaneously asserted these as objective, universal, and value free. The hegemonic discourse that higher education is primarily about economic imperatives and employability opens particular regimes of truth that profoundly shape contemporary discourses of higher education and of equity in higher education. And equity itself is often constructed through digestible, sanitized, and neutralized language. For example, we talk about equity in largely quantified and instrumentalized terms of data collection, interventions, measurement of impact, and so on. But meanwhile, higher education equity agendas become disconnected from the social problem of widening inequalities and the multidimensional socio-ecological crises facing our human and our more than human communities. Indeed, the focus becomes on equity for skills to ensure the nation state builds human capital for the jobs of the future. And this is all in a context in which most nation states fail to provide comprehensive public funding for higher education, putting pressure on institutions and individuals to focus on income generation rather than education. Students are faced with substantial debt in contexts in which many already face profound financial hardship. Academics are expected to be equitable in contexts of intensified and accelerated workloads with less resources and within corporate performative cultures concealed by discourses of excellence and the recognition of individualized forms of success. This reinforces cultures of hyper individual competitiveness, making it challenging often to collaborate, most especially with communities and people who are deemed as outside of the excellence agenda and are themselves navigating multidimensional inequities. All of this works towards the perverse outcome of widening inequalities, even while we are tasked with building equity. So, how does this misframing of higher education relate to struggles over the right to knowledge, knowing, and learning? Higher education, of course, as we all know, is never neutral or separate from complex social relations of power. Higher education and the bodies of people and knowledge positioned within it are immersed in complex power dynamics, of course. In this way, higher education plays a central role in producing and legitimating knowledge and who is recognized as knowing, and of course, who is not. These politics of knowing and knowledge have extensive implications in and beyond higher education, in mobilizing the interests of pernicious forces, including anti intellectualism, the devaluing of arts, humanities, and social sciences, plutocracies, and post truth populisms. Misrecognition, which is the unequal cultural value orders that subjugate bodies of people and knowledge associated with equity policy and discourse, is put to work in ways that impact claims to personhood, status, authority, and knowing, and of course, knowledge. Decades of critical, anti colonial, anti racist, and feminist work provide such rich insights to deepen our understanding of equity, and yet these bodies of work are largely marginalized in corporatized higher education. Equity is then dehistoricized, decontextualized, and depoliticized, making invisible struggles over status, value, authority, and personhood, as well as over access to resources, opportunities, and privileges, all of which are afforded through university access and participation, albeit in a highly inequitable, hierarchical, and stratified system. So, what are the implications of different articulations of openness for higher education's capacity to contribute to social justice transformation, and what constitutes, limits, and enables this. And of course, this is a very big question that I don't have time to fully respond to, but one aspect is an increasing openness to ignoring the forces of injustice that distort equity in the interests of privileged and powerful groups. Furthermore, we are increasingly open to datafication systems in which only that which is measurable is seen to count. In such methodological frameworks, little attention is paid to who participates in the design of research, design of evaluation, the development of policy and practice, and whose values are privileged in such processes, who is in an authoritative position to bring those values to play in processes of interpretation and the analysis of data, further popularizing reductive what works agendas for neoliberalized forms of equity. Indeed, who determines what equity is, and who is subjected to the gaze of equity, and how evidence about equity and those constructed through its classifications seems to be far from open to debate at the moment. This is inevitably harmful to those communities marginalized from the project of higher education development and the imagining of what and who higher education is for. These hegemonic framings generate what I call deficit imaginaries. So, what do I mean by deficit imaginaries? This concept emphasizes that deficit is entrenched in the ways that the problem of equity is constructed, shaping the kinds of questions we ask and the kinds of policies and practices that we take up. Deficit imaginaries are powerful in concealing the more insidious inequalities and traumas that are formed from everyday lived experiences of exclusion and marginalization. Deficit imaginaries place equity as outside of core educational practices, such as teaching and research, and projects equity into the peripheries of higher education and onto the bodies of those constructed through the stigmatizing lens of disadvantage. Equity interventions are designed to correct the perceived deficiencies of individuals diagnosed as lacking certain attributes, which are loaded with value while constructed as objective and measurable. Examples include the idea of lack of aspiration, lack of potential, lack of capability or ability, lack of resilience, lack of confidence, lack of time management, and I think the list goes on. I'm sure we can think of more examples. Inclusion is a process by which individuals associated with equity are provided remedial interventions to fit into the hegemonic system and way of being, way of doing student or academic, etc. And to be recognized as having potential, a person must first conform to the practices or the ways of being that enable recognition of potential within a particular discipline or professional context. Deficit imaginaries do harm to the soul and spirit. As one senior academic we recently interviewed as part of a broader research project puts it, and I quote her, "This is a death by a thousand cuts." In this way, deficit imaginaries ensure that we are caught in a vicious circle of perpetuating the very inequities we are seeking to remedy. So, in my book with Matt Lum, Equity in Higher Education Time for Social Justice Praxis, we weave together a rich tapestry of social justice praxis emerging from feminist, anti racist, anti colonial, and critical concepts, pedagogies, methodologies, and theories to offer a new multidimensional reframing of equity. This rich tapestry threads through the work of Nancy Fraser to understand that each dimension of injustice is intersecting and relational, working towards holding the dimensions of redistribution, recognition, and representation together, and in conversation with social justice praxis, provides conceptual and practical resources to think with, make with, and do with differently. So here I have just very briefly try to condense, what is a large body of work into some um, ways of thinking about redistribution. So the opposite, of course, is maldistribution, not having access to quality resources, supports, and opportunities to enable people and students to participate fully and to flourish. Recognition is the opposite, would be misrecognition. So challenging that unequal value order that reasserts the subjugation of gendered racialized bodies, class bodies, and bodies through ableist lens and so on. And representation, of course, would be misrepresentation, but representation demands a qualitative reframing of parity of participation that thinks about how communities historically marginalized from its development can participate in those processes of shaping policy and shaping the policies and practices that we use to develop equity frameworks in and beyond higher education. And the overall aim, of course, is flourishing and well being, supporting all members of the educational community and outside of the educational community to thrive and to experience parity of participation as fully valued and recognized members and fostering the conditions for inclusion, excellence, and transformation. And we offer this as opening critical time, space, and resources to, in Donna Haraway's words, stay with the trouble of social justice praxis, the dialogical and ongoing process of reflection, action, action, reflection, so that there is no final remedy, but just an invitation to be open to the complexities of our more than human relational being in and with the world. An overarching aim is to recognize that we are all interdependent and interconnected in relation to flourishing and well being. And in this way, open education is never an individual or private matter, but always oriented towards an ethics of care beyond ourselves. So we introduce the idea of a kind of meta methodological framework, drawing on this rich tapestry of thinking with and doing with others that we have woven together. Um, and this stands for praxis based, this deep dialogic time, space, and resources necessary for critical and collective action and reflection. Pedagogical, where everything is pedagogical, and research becomes a space of making meaning together, learning with and generating knowledge through collaboration and participation. Ethically oriented, underpinned by social justice principles, exercising an ethics of care, and a deep sense of responsibility with relational orientations to thinking, being, and doing, and methodologies that avoid decontextualization and dehumanizing methods of data collection and analysis, with an explicit commitment to reflexivity in processes of knowledge and policy formation, and flourishing and well being to support all participants to thrive in and through what we call communities of praxis. So, communities of praxis doesn't replace, it builds on the idea of communities of practice. And I know that this is a community of practice, and communities of practice are very, very important spaces in which we have the chance to share ideas, share our values, share our sense of commitment and identity. But communities of praxis kind of builds on and extends that by engaging us together in collective questioning of our shared values, identities, and assumptions that otherwise might be implicit or invisible to us through our kind of shared sensibility. The aim is to resist the reproduction of unequal cultural value orders that have exclusive effects. So, for example, whose values frame the way that we construct potential, talent, ability, and success. Communities of praxis strive towards sensitized and trauma informed awareness of power relations that are otherwise invisible in key processes such as selection, recruitment, admissions, assessment, important decision making institutionally, curriculum and pedagogical development, and so on. And transformation itself is grounded in mutual care, reciprocity, and collaboration to challenge toxic forms of hyper individualistic competitiveness. And the Center of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education, for which I'm director, and it's a fantastic group of community of praxis, really. It is a model of community of praxis, working across and with difference to co develop a suite of equity programs with student and community partners, which are all interconnected through this idea of the relational navigator framework. So on this slide, there's a number of different programs, but they're all sort of connected and interrelated through the idea of the relational navigator framework. And an ethics of care is central to the ethos of the framework, in which caring for and caring about and caring with is foregrounded. The relational navigator accompanies students in the context of their lives as a partner navigating unwieldy and fragmented domains of social, community, and student services, so both within and outside of the university or the institution, and as an advocate for students and communities navigating multidimensional injustices, traumas, and inequalities. The student is positioned as the primary navigator in this power dynamic, whilst having the support and care of the community of praxis, the relational navigator team. There is ongoing proactive co advocacy to raise awareness of the gaps in services and the implications of these absences for the well being and flourishing of those affected by the injustices of maldistribution, misrecognition, and misrepresentation. A key aim is to trouble problematic assumptions around who is seen as having the right to higher education and who is not, and to unsettle harmful deficit imaginaries that reproduce misrecognition. So I'm going to now share a case study just to give you a sense of how we're putting some of these ideas into practice through the work that we're doing and building together. So um, there's two photographs on this slide. It's not complete and it's also a bit posy, but the slides are really of different members of our Gender Justice Hub, and it's to give you a sense of that this is a really collaborative process. And unfortunately, we don't have our community members or our student members in the photos here. But as part of the UNESCO chair, we have extended the work to Ghana, where we have had ongoing, sustained relationship through networks and so on. So there's a group of Ghanaian women who are also working alongside us to build knowledge, capacity, expertise, and skills to activate higher education's crucial contribution to long term cultural transformation for gender justice and eradicating gender based violence. So, the Gender Justice Hub is a world first response to the neglected issue of gender based violence and its enduring impact on the capacity of victim survivors to access, participate in, and thrive in through and beyond higher education. The development of the hub comes as momentum is building to address gender based violence in many different national contexts. In Australia, there is a all government pledge to end gender based violence in one generation. And I know in England there are similar commitments. And I'll be interested to hear what the situation is in Canada or other countries that are represented in the network here. Um, so the hub connects academic and practitioner expertise with specialist domestic, family, and sexual violence organizations and the professional fields that uplift the status of victim survivors. So I'll just say a little bit about gender based violence. It's both rooted in and sustains gender injustice, maldistribution, misrecognition, and misrepresentation. So Nancy Fraser talks about this in her work. And it's a continuum of violence. So drawing on the work of Liz Kelly, which is really important to understand that there's a spectrum in which insidious forms of taken for granted gender discrimination enable more extreme acts of rape, domestic violence, and femicide. Globally, 1 in 3 women experience gender based violence in their lifetime. Of course, all people experience gender based violence. It's not women, but it's predominantly women who do. In Australia, 1 in 4 women experience domestic and family violence, but this is far worse for women navigating complex socioeconomic, cultural, racial, and ethnic inequalities. Gender-based violence encompasses physical, sexual, social, cultural, emotional, psychological, spiritual, reproductive, financial, and digital forms of violence. And at the moment, the predominant focus in higher education is sexual assault and sexual harassment or abuse on campus, but this kind of invisibilizes the broader context of gender based violence, which impacts so many people. And we haven't really investigated the impact on educational disadvantage over time and the impact on access to and participation in higher education. We do know that gender based violence has devastating effects on health and well being, increases the risk significantly of poverty and homelessness, does harm personally and socially. But as I said, little is known about the adverse impact of gender based violence on higher education participation. Um, so, the first step was that we undertook I guess world first research because there had been some small studies, doctoral studies in different places in the world, but there hadn't been a kind of large scale study to explore the impact of gender-based violence over the life course on access to and participation in higher education. And so what we found was that the impact is exacerbated by the invisibility of gender-based violence as a social epidemic, the profound maldistribution that gender-based violence creates, the stigmatization of victim survivors, and the deficit imaginaries present in higher education. And so I've just chosen some examples across the data of the different expressions that the students have brought about the experience of accessing higher education. So these are student victim survivors. 430 students participated in our research, which was both a comprehensive survey, which included quantitative and qualitative data, which was looking at both the time and the spaces and places in which gender-based violence had been experienced, but also focusing on how that had impacted on access to and participation in higher education. And then we followed up with 48 in-depth interviews. So these quotes come from both the interviews and from the surveys. And I'll just give you a little flavor. So please excuse our attendance rates for compulsory tutorials. We are often going through wars at home that no one knows about. Attendance in the middle of one of those wars could mean additional violence for us. My partner made it impossible for me to study by behaving in a violent and controlling way. This prevented me from being able to meet assessment deadlines. I felt extremely afraid and isolated. I was deeply afraid that my partner would find the letters and emails and become violent from higher education. This resulted in a huge student debt. After I experienced domestic violence, I was homeless, living in my car. I did my first ever final exams at university the day after sleeping in my car. Gender based violence makes you feel small and stupid. Certain experiences made my self esteem go right down, and it made me think, why am I studying this degree? How could I be of use to anyone? The after effects of abuse lowered my self confidence and esteem so that I felt like I did not deserve a better life. You can't get over this feeling you're not worthy. You don't even deserve to be here. So we can see here sort of the workings of both maldistribution and misrecognition, but also misrepresentation because these students had felt incredibly isolated because the invisibility of their experience made it feel like they were the only ones, they were the odd people out who were experiencing this. And so this research study enabled them to sort of voice their experiences. And one of the things that came out of this was there are many recommendations. Um, and the recommendations led to the development of our Gender Justice Hub, which is a community and student partner sort of hub that involves research, navigational support, arts based programs to build connection and belonging. All the artwork on these slides are from the students who participated, and equipping future graduates to be change agents in their professional fields and as future leaders or as current leaders, and being able to mobilize their knowledge for the project to end gender-based violence and build gender justice. So the hub's goals are to enable victim survivors to access, participate, and thrive in and beyond higher education, ensure that they inform a transformed higher education sector that contributes to gender justice and challenging gender-based violence, prepare the next generation of professionals to understand and challenge gender injustice and its manifestation in gender-based violence, help universities and other professional organizations to become change drivers in the fight against gender-based violence, and recognize and leverage the knowledge, insight, and capacity of student victim survivors for societal and institutional transformation. And as I said, this is just a kind of sample. Actually, we have over 30 recommendations that have emerged from our analysis of the 430 surveys and 48 in-depth interviews. And these are really important insights that the students have brought to higher education institutions and policymakers about what we can actually do differently, not only to build gender justice and its relationship to its intersection with racial justice and all other forms of justice, but also to combat gender-based violence and to raise consciousness that this is a social issue and not an individual problem to be overcome by the individual victim survivor. So we actually have developed a digital gender justice hub, which we're going to be making public in the next month or so. And all of the recommendations will be there. So I'll make sure that Rob and Beck can circulate that once it becomes live, so you can have a look at the publications, the artwork, and the recommendations, and see where it might resonate with work that you're doing in your own context. So I'm going to end with some final reflections. I have argued for a new imaginary of higher education equity embedded in openness to critical reflection and action or praxis, and firmly positioned against multidimensional forces of injustice. As a powerful social institution of knowledge formation, deeply entwined with the orientations that shape our present and future directions, higher education is entangled in the complex social relations that, when left unchallenged, contribute to the multiscalar crises of our times, including the deepening of inequalities and social divisions, instabilities, conflict, violence, global pandemics, disease and viruses, climate change and environmental degradation, and ongoing ignorance of the harm of colonial histories and neo-colonial dispositions. Simultaneously, higher education generates knowledge to address these crises, and so we must resist falling into the trap of polarizing thinking. With a more holistic responsibility of higher education to challenge multidimensional social injustice in mind, we can reject the decontextualization of higher education from these urgent societal concerns. When insidious inequities and traumas are ignored, they unravel our institutional and personal efforts, investments, and commitments to equity. We need to urgently open our imagination to higher education rooted in social and ecological justice by fostering a culture of solidarity and compassion. This means being serious about equity, recognizing its deep complexity, thinking carefully about the key messages we communicate, and holding ourselves responsible to communities navigating social, economic, cultural, and representational inequalities and injustices. Students and community partners are co-leaders with higher education in reframing its purpose through the valuable knowledge generated from their experience and expertise. We simply cannot contemplate a system of higher education that puts equity at the center without recognizing the value of this diverse and rich body of knowledge. The narrowing of higher education for job ready, market centric, commercialized purposes undermines our capacity to eradicate poverty, reduce inequalities, promote gender equality, and build peace, justice, and strong institutions, key sustainable development goals that center equity and social justice. Hyper individualism, entrenched as it is in a culture of competitiveness rather than collaboration, compassion, and solidarity, is toxic for us all. Ignoring multidimensional injustices is ultimately damaging for sustainable higher education, closing rather than opening our imaginative capacity while doing harm to our students and to ourselves. If we ignore these social imperatives, we ignore our long term collective flourishing and well being, rooted as it is in our inevitable interdependencies, interconnectedness, and relational being and doing. It is only together, then, that we can transform higher education as an open, participatory, and equitable space that is concerned with our interconnected, interdependent, more than human flourishing. Thank you so much for listening, and I really look forward to the brief time that we have together now to have a bit of a conversation. Thank you.